How do you build credit for the first time? How can you build credit without actually borrowing money? And how can studies, averages, and comparisons cause us to make bad financial decisions? We'll answer these questions and more on this, the 80th episode of the Dough Roller Podcast.
Welcome to the Dough Roller Podcast, where the best thing money can buy is financial freedom. We help you make more, spend less, and invest the rest. And now your host, Rob Berger.
Whether you're just starting out, buried under a mountain of debt, or well on your way to financial freedom, this is the podcast to help you take your finances to the next level. Hey, everybody, this podcast is sponsored by Betterment, the most preferred automated investing service. Betterment has cutting-edge technology to optimize returns, minimize taxes, and save you time and money. Join over 34,000 customers who have already streamlined their portfolio management at betterment.com/roller. That's betterment.com/ROLLER. Hey, everybody, it's been a heck of a night for me. You know, I'm generally a really good sleeper. I go to bed and I'm asleep in just a few minutes. And last night, I don't know what it was. I went to bed around 10:30. I didn't get to sleep until 2. And so there I was up and back downstairs reading a whole bunch of stuff. Here I am. It's like 1 a.m. I'm switching between reading a book called Damn Right, Behind the Scenes with Berkshire Hathaway billionaire Charlie Munger. It's a biography of Munger, and so far it's just a wonderful, wonderful book. And, I'd get a little tired of reading, so then I'd shift over, and I found myself about 1 a.m. Completing a spreadsheet of Wells Fargo's 10-year history of earnings per share and dividends, looking at their percentage of increase from year to year or decrease in the 08, 09, 2010 period with the financial crisis of their earnings per share. They're looking at their dividend payout ratios, looking at their increases or decreases to dividends, and kind of crazy, I guess, to do that at 1 a.m. But I couldn't sleep, and so there you go. Fascinating little I guess experiment, if you will. I'm going to share more about dividend investing in the coming weeks and months. But I tell you, when you put something like that in a spreadsheet and you look at the numbers and how they change from year to year and over periods of time, it really gives you some insight that you don't get, just by reading the financial news or even going to Morningstar and looking at some of the data. And I tell you, Wells Fargo has just been hitting it out of the park in the last few years with their earnings per share growth, their dividend growth, and they're doing it all in part because they're growing their bottom line. But they've been able to increase dividend payouts significantly without increasing what's called their payout ratio, which is the amount of their dividends as compared to their earnings per share. Some companies keep increasing dividends by shelling out more and more and more of their earnings in the form of dividends. The problem with that is you can only do that for so long. Then you run out of earnings to shell out in the form of dividends. But Wells Fargo, I think, if I've got the number right, last year their payout ratio was around 29%. And so a very safe payout ratio. That means they've got 71% of earnings left. It's not as if they're having to shell out all of their earnings in the form of dividends to keep up a healthy dividend payout each year. So anyway, that's what I did last night. So I'm a little groggy today as I record this episode. Hopefully what I'll say today at least kind of makes sense. Even if you disagree with it, hopefully at least I put a noun in a verb in every sentence. We'll see. So got a couple of things for you today. The main topic is a question that came in from a reader named Esther that we'll get to in a minute, but it deals with how to build credit when you're just starting out. Before I get to that, wanted to share a couple of things with you. One is, I mentioned the book, the Munger biography, Damn Right, that I'm reading. One of the things I want to do is from time to time share with you things that I read that I think might be helpful to you. I'm still in the middle of that book. But one thing I wanted to mention today was a blog that I read. I've subscribed to their newsletter, which very, very much like mine, goes out once a week. And the blog is called, it's not really an investing or personal finance blog per se. It's called Farnam Street Blog, Farnam, Farnam, Street Blog. Street is spelled out, farnamstreetblog.com. It's a wonderful, wonderful blog written by Shane Parrish. And it's a blog about, Shane does a lot of reading about everything from investing to life, learning, science, history. and he writes about it and the things that he learns from the books that he reads. And it's a delightful blog. And it's one I wanted to recommend to you. It's interesting. Farnam Street, the name came from actually a recognition of Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger. Farnam Street is the street that Warren Buffett lives on in Omaha. And that's where the name of this blog comes from. But as I said, it's not an investing or personal finance blog. I mean, he certainly reads books related to investing, and we'll talk about them. But it's more about thinking and knowledge and improving in all kinds of areas of life. You'll see that when if you check out the blog. It's definitely not an investing blog. But one of the articles that caught my attention, and actually I sent this out on my Twitter feed, which you can check out. It's just at the @ at Dough Roller, and I tend to send out 3 to 5 tweets a day. Almost always links to things that I found interesting. So anyway, one of the articles that he had written recently was Warren Buffett on Scorecards, Investing Friends, and the Family Motto. And I think it's definitely worth a read. I thought it was quite good. One of the things in that is the Buffett Family Motto. According to Warren Buffett, it's this: spend less than you make could, in fact, have been the Buffett Family Motto if accompanied by its corollary, don't go into debt. We're going to actually talk about those things a little bit later today. He also mentioned, he's quoting Warren Buffett on why he wanted money. And here's what Buffett had to say: it could make me independent. Then I could do what I wanted to do with my life. He goes on to say, and the biggest thing I wanted to do was work for myself. I didn't want other people directing me. The idea of doing what I wanted to do every day was important to me. That's something that I did not appreciate when I was starting out at all. To me, money was it certainly provided for the family, and then it enabled you to buy fun things, whether it was a big house, car, whatever. That was my view of money. And about 7-8 years ago, it changed. And now my view is kind of more consistent with what Warren Buffett describes. It gives you independence to do not nothing, but rather what it is you want to do with your life. That's my view anyway. And so, in any event, back to Farnam Street blog. I think that's definitely a blog worth checking out. The article that I just mentioned, I think, was quite good, and it's a blog that I enjoy. As I said, I get their newsletter, so I don't go to the blog every day. I just wait for the email and then pick and choose what I like and read it. And actually, that's how I found the Munger biography. Damn right, it was mentioned in a post on the Farnam Street blog, and so I bought that book, and I'm reading through it now. So anyway, you ought to give Farnam Street blog a look. I think you'll like it. The second thing, before we get to the main topic today, is I've been reading a whole host of things on the internet that kind of came together in my mind around a single idea. And it's this, if you read any of the financial news, folks are constantly referencing studies or averages. So they'll say, a study shows, for example, that if you use credit cards, you'll spend more than if you use cash. A study shows that if you invest on your own, you're more likely to bail out of stocks when the market goes south than if you have and pay for an advisor. Or averages, the average expense ratio of a mutual fund is 1.12%, or the average cost of a fee-only advisor is 1%. Journalists and bloggers, myself included, we love to pick up on these studies and throw them in as a citation to a blog post we're writing or an online article. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. And I've done it plenty of times. But here's the idea I had, and that is, as we actually go about making financial decisions, we have to be very careful that we don't get too comfortable using studies and averages to make ourselves feel good about the decisions that we're making. As an example, the one study I heard referenced was that if you're a do-it-yourself investor, you're more likely to bail out of stocks in a down market. Now, I haven't actually been able to find that study, so I'm kind of taking someone at their word, but assuming it's true for a moment. Well, that's fine, except that it's got really nothing to do with you or me. What we have to figure out is how will we react. The fact that 57% of do-it-yourself investors bail out of stocks, that's neither here nor there. The question is, how will you respond to a down market? And if you think there is a chance of bailing out, which is, a bad thing to do, How do you keep yourself from doing it? The answer may be hire a financial advisor, but not necessarily. In fact, I know plenty of both commission-based brokers and fee-only advisors who have told me that during the down market, they lost a ton of clients who took their money and left the stock market. So there, having an advisor didn't help them. May help you, it may not. Just having a well-diversified portfolio may help you. Investing in index funds rather than actively managed funds may help you because, yes, the market, your investments may be down, but it'll be because of the market, not because of some manager who's made bad decisions. Maybe rethinking your allocation between stocks and bonds will help you stick to your investing plan. But the point is, these studies may be interesting, but we ought not rely on them too heavily when we're making our financial decisions. The same is true with averages. If you've got a bunch of mutual funds charging you 1% in expense ratios, it may feel good to know that, well, the average is 1.12, so my mutual funds cost less than the average. But is that really the measure? Is that the bar we should set? I mean, because you can get index funds for 5 basis points or 10 basis points. So who cares that the average is 1.12%? Well, just a thought for you to consider today, something that I've been thinking about as I go through and evaluate my own investments. Okay, on to the main topic, which, as I said, comes from a listener named Esther. She wrote me an email, sent me an email the other day, and here's what she had to say. She said, "Thanks so much for writing a fantastic blog and sharing your podcast. My husband and I are just My husband and I just started listening a few weeks ago and have learned a great deal. We're still in our 20s, but we often tell each other how we wish we would have known about financial independence and building credit earlier on in our lives to prevent all of the mistakes we made in college. We really want to teach our children about financial independence so they can avoid the same mistakes we made. So my question is, how can an 18-year-old start building credit the right way?" Well, that's a great question, Esther. And since you're in your 20s, I assume you've got some time to think about this before you have to educate your children at the age of 18. But a great question, one that I've thought a lot about as our children have just recently, in the last couple of years, graduated from high school. So they're kind of right in, they're the target audience for your question. And so I've given a lot of thought to this. And so I'll share my thoughts with you on this topic. And I've written about it, too, from time to time on the blog. The show notes for this podcast will be found at doughroller.net /podcast 80, podcast 80. And so all of the resources and links and so forth that I refer to here today, you'll find in those show notes. And I also will link to other articles I've written in the past that deal with this. So let's kind of walk through the approach that I think is best. And the very first thing I want to talk about has nothing to do with building credit, because I think it's important when we're dealing with any personal finance or investing issue that we put it in the right context, right? So I don't think most folks would say my goal in life is to have a great credit score, or even my goal in personal finance is to have a great credit score. I mean, a great credit score or a good credit score is a means to an end. It's a means to perhaps one, qualifying for a mortgage, and two, qualifying for a mortgage at the best interest rate available, right? So I think we need to put this question in some context, because to me, even for someone just starting out, a good credit score is not it's not irrelevant, but it's not and should not be their main priorities. So what are their main priorities? To me, there are 3 things. Again, priorities related to personal finance. 3 things. 1, spend less than you make. 2, invest wisely. 3, avoid debt. To me, those are the 3 key financial priorities that every young adult should focus on, and actually really all of us should focus on. I mean, those priorities don't change. Circumstances change. How we approach these things, of course, changes. And if you're older like I am, then maybe you've had time to screw things up, and so you got to dig yourself out of a hole too. So you got those issues. But to me, those are the priorities that I'm trying to convey to my children, and that I think young adults should be focused on. Spend less than you make, invest wisely, and avoid debt. And if you do those things, first of all, you'll never be in financial difficulty. I mean, you could have issues where you lose a job and that sort of thing. But I mean, you're not going to spend yourself into a financial mess. One of the things that, I mentioned that Dave Ramsey was sort of my motivation to get out of debt 7 years ago, listening to his show. But I thought, wouldn't it be great if none of us needed Dave Ramsey? None of us needed his baby steps, right? If we all, we didn't get ourselves into trouble to begin with, wouldn't that be fantastic? Of course, that's I guess not the reality for many of us, and I certainly had debt that I had to deal with. and found his show motivating. But if you go back to someone just starting out, if you can get a hold of them before they make all the mistakes that perhaps you and I have made, then they're going to be ahead of the game. And again, spend less than you make, invest wisely, avoid debt. Now, why do I bring that up in the context of building credit? Because I think you need to keep those things in mind as particularly for young adult as you're making financial decisions, including building credit. Those really should be your goals, not building credit. Building credit can be part of that, sure, right? So, for example, as I mentioned, a good credit score can help you get a much lower rate on a mortgage, which causes you to spend less, which helps you spend less than you make, and you can invest the difference. So these things are all related, but I think it's important to look at credit and credit scores and building credit in that bigger context, because sometimes folks get so focused on building credit that it can cause them to do some dumb things, or perhaps less than ideal things, I guess I should say. And so we'll walk through that now. So what are the first things? If you're keeping those priorities in mind, we want to build credit for young adults, someone just starting out. Where do you start? So to me, the first place is this. If it's available to you, become an authorized user on someone else's credit card. Now, what does that mean? So usually for a young adult, it's becoming an authorized user on a parent's credit card. But you can add an authorized user to your account. I actually am going to do that for my children. I haven't yet, but I logged into my Capital One account, and you can do it online. And they become an authorized user. I'm still in control of the account. I can close the credit card anytime I want. I can remove them as authorized users anytime I want. I'm still in control. They cannot go in and request an increase in the credit limit. I'm the one that's responsible for paying the bill. But they are an authorized user, and they can actually get a credit card. It's up to me if I give it to them. In fact, when I looked at the form online with Capital One, there was a choice that I could check. Do I want a new credit card issued in this person's name or not? So I could add them as an authorized user, but not have a credit card issued to them. Or I could have them as an authorized user, have the credit card issued to them, but I could hold on to it and perhaps only give it to them in certain circumstances. Or, of course, I could give them the credit card. And obviously, we would have to have a long conversation before I did that. But once they're added as an authorized user, in most cases, the history of that credit card is reported to their credit report at the credit bureaus, just like it is for me. They're treated like the other owners, if you will, or account holders of the credit card. And so they can begin to build a credit history and obtain a FICO credit score, even if they never use the credit card. Now, that may seem kind of crazy and not make a lot of sense, and in some ways it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, but that's how the system works. And I guess the theory is because they are authorized users, they have some level of responsibility with this account, even if they don't ever receive a credit card. And so the FICO formula does count that towards the individual's credit history, assuming that the credit card company, in fact, when they report the usage of that card to the credit bureaus, report and add to that the authorized user and include their information when they report to the credit bureaus. So with that, there are a couple of things to keep in mind with becoming an authorized user. First of all, as I've mentioned, you don't actually have to use the card to build credit. That's one of the reasons I like it, because it's one of the ways you don't have to go into debt to build credit. Second thing to keep in mind, you can actually be harmed as an authorized user. It's one thing you get added to someone's credit card and then they start paying the credit card late or they default and it gets charged off. That can affect the authorized user's credit as well. And in fact, I've heard from readers who have said, they were put on their parents' card when they were 18, everything was fine. They kind of forgot about it after a while. And then at 30, they check their credit score and they see it's tanked and they realize they're still an authorized user and their parents have messed up their finances and started paying the credit card late. So there's a good side to this, but there's also a bad side. And with that, the third thing to keep in mind is if your credit is being harmed because the credit card holder is not, say, paying their bills on time, you can call up the credit card company and ask to be removed as an authorized user. The other thing that I would do is call up the credit bureaus in conjunction with the credit card company and ask for that negative payment history to be removed from your credit file on the basis that you weren't the one charging up the card and missing the payments. Now, that may or may not work, but I think it's worth the effort. The fourth thing here is this. Not all creditors will report authorized users to the credit bureaus. So, it's important to keep that in mind. Don't just assume because you're added as an authorized user that you'll start to build a credit history. I think most of the major credit card issuers do report authorized users. And in the show notes, again, doorroller.net/podcast80, I have a link to a MyFICO forum where folks sort of chime in and say, yeah, this credit card does report, this one doesn't, this one does, this one doesn't. The URL is long, so it's not even worth trying to read it off to you. But again, the link is in the show notes, and you'll find it there. Now, the last thing I want to mention before we move away from authorized user, this sort of strategy to building credit, is that there is something in the industry known as piggybacking. In a way, being an authorized user is a form of piggybacking. But here's the distinction. With an authorized user, you have an existing relationship with the credit card, the cardholder, usually a parent and a child, right? But there's an pre-existing relationship, and that's why you're adding them as an authorized user, and that's fine. But with other forms of piggybacking, there can be times where in credit counseling companies, shady companies, can help facilitate this, where you can actually become an authorized user on someone's credit card, and you don't know them. You have no idea. You've never met them. They have great credit, and you just get added as an authorized user to build your credit. And you say, well, wait a minute. Why would a stranger add me as an authorized user? Well, they do it for a fee. And of course, in that circumstance, you do not get a credit card, right? Because this is a stranger. So they just add you. They don't send you the credit card. You pay a fee. And FICO has gotten better at figuring out when there's a relationship and when there's not. Obviously, they can do that through name, potentially through address. It's not a perfect system, but FICO and the credit bureaus definitely try to figure out whether there's an existing relationship where being an authorized user makes sense versus when you're just piggybacking to try to increase your score. So I would avoid all of that piggybacking nonsense completely. But again, if you've got a relationship, again, with a parent-child, is I think probably the most common. Becoming an authorized user can be helpful. Another circumstance when this comes up is, perhaps you've got a relationship with someone. Maybe you're engaged, you're going to get married, and eventually you might have joint accounts. But you can become an authorized user of your significant other, and that can help build credit as well. So that to me is sort of the first and easiest step, the first and easiest way for someone just starting out to build credit. Now, again, if you don't give them a credit card, there's no risk of going into debt and all that sort of thing. The second step is to go ahead and get a credit card. I should add, and use it wisely. Obviously, if you get a credit card, it's going to affect your credit. If you pay your bills on time, keep your balances relatively low as compared to your credit limit, it's going to affect your credit score positively. Pay your bills late, max out the credit card, it's going to affect your credit negatively. So again, it's a two-edged sword. This works if you use it wisely. Now, one of the reasons I started with the 3 financial priorities, spend less than you make, invest wisely, and avoid debt, is because of this section of this podcast. One of the worst things to do, particularly when you're just starting out, is to apply for a credit card and rack up debt. You need to do everything possible to avoid that scenario. And if that means not building a credit score, don't build a credit score. I'd rather, have no credit card debt and no credit history than to try to build credit and wind up in $5,000, $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 of credit card debt that's going to take you years to get out of. It's absolutely miserable. So I do have a few sort of tips to help you use a credit card wisely. I'll go through those. Also want to give you some ideas of the types of credit cards you might want to consider. So let's walk through a few things. First, prepaid cards and bank debit cards do not build your credit. There was a time when prepaid cards marketed themselves as helping you build a certain type of credit score, although not a FICO score. I think the regulators in Washington pretty much shut that down. So to be clear, prepaid cards and bank debit cards do not build credit. I mean, they can be great tools. And over the years, prepaid cards, for example, have gotten much, much better than they used to be in terms of lower fees and great benefits. But they don't build credit. So that's the first thing. Okay. The second thing is there are credit cards that are designed for those with no credit history. Two examples would be student credit cards. Obviously, if you're a college student, they're designed for folks like you with no credit history and maybe not even much of any income. And the second type are secured credit cards. Secured credit cards require you to send in a security deposit that will sort of secure your future payment of the credit card. And your credit limit is usually limited to the amount of your deposit. So, for example, you might send in $500 to Capital One, for example. They have a secured credit card. They'll hold on to that money as long as you have the secured credit card, and then you'll just go about using the credit card like any other traditional credit card. You'll make charges, and you'll pay it off at the end of the month. You'll make charges, pay it off at the end of the month, and Capital One just holds the $500 as security. And eventually, what you'll end up doing is transferring from that secured card to a more traditional credit card, and you'll get your deposit back. Now, a couple of things about both of these cards, student credit cards and secured credit cards. First, with student credit cards, believe it or not, just because you're a student doesn't mean you're guaranteed to get approved. And I'm a walking example of that. I have a vivid memory of being in college, excited to get a credit card. For me back then, it was a sign of being an adult, really stupid. But what can I tell you? And I applied for a Citibank student credit card. I was in college, and they denied me. I was like, what? How is that possible? I mean, this card is for people like me. I don't have a job, and I have no credit history, but somehow I got denied. Things may have changed a bit since then. I did go to college a long, long time ago. But I guess it's just to point out it's not a guarantee that you'll get approved, but they are designed for folks with no credit history. And in fact, Discover just came out with a new version of their student credit card called the Chrome. If you go to the show notes in this episode, I link to a page with some student credit cards that you can check out. Citibank has a number of student credit cards, and I know Bank of America does. So there's a number to choose from. With secured credit cards, the big thing to keep in mind there is that they almost all come with annual fees. I know of no secured credit card that doesn't have an annual fee. And so they can be a great way to build credit, particularly if you have trouble getting other types of credit cards, but you'll want to move away from them as soon as you're able to because of that annual fee. All right, the next thing is, and this goes to how to kind of avoid getting into trouble with credit cards, and this may be a requirement with your first card anyway, but here it is: keep your credit limit low. There's no sense, if you could get it, to go out and get several $1,000s in credit if you think you're going to charge up the card, if you think there's a risk of that. Keep your credit limit at $500. And if they offer you more, don't take it. Say, no, thank you. Let's keep it at $500. Now, for you credit scoring ninjas out there, you may be thinking, wait a minute, Rob, but isn't credit utilization a factor in the FICO score? And so isn't the more unused credit you have on the card better? It is absolutely correct. If you've listened to the podcast with Tom Quinn, which is podcast 2, doorroller.net/podcast 2, Tom Quinn is the credit expert at FICO. We talked about utilization rates. He says you really should try to keep them under 30%, which would mean for every $1,000 of credit, you wouldn't want a balance of more than $300. And he says if you can keep it at 20%, that's better. And if you can keep it at 10%, that's even better still. So absolutely true. But what I'm trying to balance is improving your credit score and going into debt. And if I had to err one way or the other, I would avoid going into debt. And if you think having a card with a lot of credit is going to, create temptations for you, I would just avoid it, because that's the number one thing here. It's fine to build credit with a credit card, but not if you go into debt. And one way to avoid that is to keep your credit limit low. The other thing I do is I just only use it for everyday expenses that you would have to use anyway. So, for example, for gas or groceries, I wouldn't use it, to go on a vacation unless you've got the money in the bank to pay for it. And then one of the things I do, and one of the reasons I love YNAB, the budgeting tool, which I've talked about many times, is that when I use a credit card, that transaction gets recorded in my budget as if I've spent the money, because I have spent the money. And when I want to know how much money do I have left to spend for the month, I don't go look at my checking account balance. Why? Because that credit card transaction that I may have used a day earlier hasn't come out of my checking account yet. I haven't paid the credit card bill. But it is reflected in my YNAB budget. So I go to my YNAB budget and I say, okay, that tells me how much I have left for the month, not my checking account balance. And so I found that to be a very helpful way to control spending while still using credit cards. And then the last thing, obviously, critical, pay your credit card in full every single month. It is an absolute must. Now, one last thing before we move away from credit cards, and it's this. Some will recommend store-branded credit cards. I've probably mentioned it as an option in the past, or a gas credit card, because sometimes they can be a little easier to get. I really don't recommend them as a way to build credit. They will build credit, but I don't recommend them for a couple of reasons. One is interest rates on these cards are really, really high. Again, irrelevant if you pay off the balance in full each month, but boy, if you don't, you're going to get hit with really high interest rates. The second thing is that for store brand cards, not so much for gas cards, but for store brand cards, you can't use them for your everyday essentials like gas and groceries. If you've got a Macy's store credit card, there's not a whole lot you can do with that card for your essential expenses. And it can be tempting to hit the Macy's store and buy some stuff that maybe you don't need. And again, the goal here is to keep you out of credit card debt. So that's why I'm very cautious when it comes to using store-branded credit cards, particularly for young folks who don't have a track record yet of managing money. I just think it's a real danger. Okay, so how about other types of loans? Obviously, you can build credit with other types of loans. You can get a car loan. It will build credit. You can, of course, you may have student debt, and that will build credit. Now, these are decisions that everyone has to make. My recommendation is avoid all other types of debt. Don't ever get a car loan. Don't get student loans. You say, well, that's going to make it difficult. I may have to make some tough choices. Yes, you will. Did I make those tough choices when I was just starting out? No, I didn't, and I wish I had. Instead, I graduated with $55,000 in school loans, and this was in 1992. In today's dollars, that's six figures. And yes, I borrowed for my first few cars, and I wish I hadn't. So to me, it's not a recommended approach to building credit. Now, that being said, I recognize that folks do get car loans, folks do get student loans, and so the key there, if you do have those types of loans, they will build a credit history. Your goal is to make sure that they build a very positive credit history. And so the simple key is make your monthly payments on time each and every month, period. With these types of loans, credit utilization doesn't really work like it does with revolving credit like credit cards, because with car loans and student loans, and this would be true for a home mortgage, as you pay down the loan, it doesn't give you access to more credit, right? You can't then borrow back up like with revolving credit. So the real key with car loans, student loans, and that sort of thing, other installment loans, is to make the payment each and every month on time. And by the way, and I've mentioned this before, but if a late payment shows up on your credit history, it stays there for 7 years. It's a big deal. And payment history is the biggest factor in establishing your FICO score. It's the biggest factor in the FICO formula. So late payments will really hurt your credit score. Now, I will say this, even though they stay on your credit history for 7 years, they don't affect your credit score the same for that entire 7-year period. The older they are on your history, the less and less they actually affect your credit score. But who wants to deal with that? They have a big impact on your credit score. Avoid them. Pay your debts on time, every time. And that's basically it. That's the simple way to build your credit. I would suggest, as a way to track your progress, to sign up for Credit Karma or Credit Sesame. Now, again, for your credit ninjas out there, you're saying, wait a minute, Rob, those don't give you your FICO score. It's true, they don't. They give you, I guess, what some would call an educational score. So they don't give you your FICO score. If you want your FICO score, you need to go to, well, there's a couple ways to get it. I mentioned in an earlier podcast, actually some credit cards will give it to you. If you have a Discover or Barclay card, for example, you can also go to My FICO, and they will, for a fee, you can get your FICO credit score. But here's the thing. Credit Sesame and Credit Karma are both free. You don't have to even give a credit card to access your credit score through their formula. And while it's not a FICO formula, it's very, very similar. And for purposes of building your credit, it's really all you need. It will show you what's helping your score and what's hurting your score. You will see how it changes over time, and they have a lot of great resources on how to build your credit. And even though they're not showing you a FICO score, the formulas are very similar. And if you're improving those educational scores, you're improving your FICO score. Because it's free and easy, it's what I recommend as a way to sort of track your progress. Now, before we bring this podcast to a close, I want to just touch on one other topic related to this, and that is the difference between establishing credit for the first time versus repairing your credit. Now, when you're repairing your credit, it's usually after you've maybe you've mishandled the credit you had, late payments, charge-offs, that sort of thing. Maybe you've gone through a bankruptcy, maybe you've gone through a foreclosure. And many of the things that you will need to do are very similar to what I just walked through. You may need to get a secured credit card, for example, and obviously start paying your existing debt on time and all of those things. But there are some differences, and I just want to touch on them briefly. If you're repairing credit rather than trying to establish credit for the first time, one, make sure you check your credit report for errors. That's a must. If there are errors in your credit report, correcting them can be the quickest and easiest way to improve your score. Obviously, if you're starting out with no credit history, then there's nothing to check. It's probably still worth seeing if you have a credit history, credit report, but assuming you don't, there's obviously no potential errors to deal with. But if you're repairing your credit, you'll want to check for those errors. The second thing is, as I mentioned previously, the baggage that you've got with your credit, again, whatever your situation is, stays on your report for a very long time. And so there's going to have to be some patience. You're not going to just flip a switch and have great credit overnight. It's going to take some time. And so there's some patience that you just need to, I guess it's kind of setting expectations. As I mentioned, though, the good news is the bad things on your credit report age, they affect your credit score less and less. And so that's great. But again, you're going to need to be patient. The third thing is in terms of credit cards, your options will be a little bit more limited. Particularly if you're older, student credit card is going to be out of the question. And there are also credit cards available for those with no credit, traditional credit cards available for those with no credit, but they would not be available for those who have bad credit. And so what you're likely going to have to get, your options are likely going to be limited to either a secured credit card, which I think is a fine option, or a credit card designed for folks with poor credit. The problem there is interest rates will just be astronomical, and the costs are typically very high, even higher than a secured credit card. So those are some things to think about. Repairing credit is different than establishing credit for the first time. Again, there's a lot of similarities of things you need to do, but there are some differences. Well, hey, I hope you found this information helpful. Esther, thank you so much for emailing in your question. It was a great one. If you have experience doing this, whether it's establishing credit for the first time or perhaps repairing credit, I'd love to hear your story. Feel free to shoot me an email at dr@doorroller.net, and would love to hear from you. Also, for those of you that have made it all the way to the end of this podcast, two quick announcements. The first is, as you know from the Kate and Trevor podcast, I'm starting to interview people for this show. So if you'd like to be on the Dough Roller Money podcast, I'd love to hear from you. Whether you have a success story you want to share, maybe you have a difficult situation you want to talk through, and you'd be willing to do it on the show so that perhaps others could benefit from our discussion. And I'd love to have you on the show. And it doesn't even have to be long. A lot of my interviews are 30 or 45 minutes, but I might string together several interviews in one podcast. And if you're, maybe you've got a quick question and it'll be a 5 or 10 minute conversation on the podcast, that's fine. So if you're interested in that, being on the show, would love to hear from you. Email me at dr@doughroller.net. The second thing I wanted to mention is in the Kate and Trevor podcast, if you've listened to it, their cat Mayhem was in the background. We could hear their cat, and they ended up sending me a picture of Mayhem, which I've added to the show notes for their podcast. This is podcast 77. So if you go to doughroller.net/podcast 77, you will actually see a picture of their adorable cat at the end of the podcast. Now, I mentioned there that Mayhem was going to become the mascot of the show. Well, it was interesting. That actually got a reaction from folks. They said, "Wait a minute! I've got an adorable animal. You ought to consider for the mascot before you make your choice." And I thought, well, First of all, if there's going to be a mascot of Dough Roller, it's going to have to be Sophie. Sophie is she's a Shih Tzu who is just adorable. And if you go to the About page of our blog, you can see a picture of her, doughroller.net/about. You'll see a picture of Sophie. However, if you've got a cute picture you want to send in so that maybe your pet can be the mascot of a podcast episode, I don't know if you crazy people are going to be into this. I don't know if I'll get no email from you or if 500 people will email me with pictures of their dogs and cats and tarantulas and whatever else you got. But I mean, if there's an interest out there, I'm happy to put a picture per podcast in the show notes and have a mascot for each episode. Happy to do that if there's interest. So if that's something you're into, shoot me an email, include a picture, and we'll see where it goes. Okay. Hope you enjoyed the podcast. As always, shoot me an email with any questions or comments you have, dr@doughroller.net. And until next time, remember, the best thing money can buy is financial freedom.